She never thought something like this would happen to her. She had read countless stories on the internet about people fighting for justice, about those who had gone through unimaginable hardships and somehow come out the other side. But she never imagined she would be one of them. That day was burned into her memory in a way that felt almost unnatural. Every detail, every sound, every sensation was lodged in her mind as if she were still trapped in that moment. It started like any other morning, quiet, unremarkable. But then the call came, and in an instant, the world as she knew it shattered. A baby had been found in the cemetery, abandoned on top of a grave. It took a few seconds for her to even register what she was hearing. The voice on the other end of the line sounded urgent, almost frantic, but her mind struggled to connect the words into something that made sense. A baby? Left on a grave? She didn't understand. It wasn't until the person repeated it louder this time that the full weight of what was happening hit her with crushing force. Her sister's grave. The baby was on her sister's grave. Her legs nearly gave out beneath her, and she had to grip the edge of the counter just to stay upright. A cold sweat broke out on her skin, and for a few horrible seconds, she thought she might pass out. How could this be real? How could someone be so cruel? Her sister had just been buried 3 days ago, and now, her child, her own flesh and blood, had been discarded like an afterthought, left alone in the cold, surrounded by nothing but tombstones and silence. It made no sense. It was the kind of thing that happened in movies, not real life. And yet, it was real. It was happening. She didn't even remember how she got to the cemetery. One moment, she was in her apartment, and the next she was standing in front of the wrought iron gates, barely able to breathe. The sight that greeted her was something she would never, ever forget. The baby was so small, so still, wrapped in nothing but a thin cloth lying on the cold stone slab, his tiny face pale, almost bluish. It looked like he wasn't even breathing. That was when the fear truly set in, deep, clawing terror that made her stomach twist and her hands shake. She barely heard the voices around her, the murmurs of the crowd that had gathered. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat as she took a hesitant step forward, then another. And then she was running, falling to her knees beside the grave, reaching out with trembling hands to touch the baby's cheek. Cold. He was so cold. Her breath caught in her throat as she touched the baby's icy skin. It felt wrong. So wrong that something so fragile, so helpless, had been left in a place meant for the dead. Her hands were trembling as she lifted the tiny body from the grave, half expecting him to be lifeless. But then, the faintest movement. A breath, shallow and weak. He was alive. A sob tore from her chest before she could stop it, her fingers tightening around the small bundle as if sheer willpower could somehow transfer warmth into his tiny, frozen frame. "Someone call an ambulance." The words barely registered in her mind. She didn't even know if she had spoken them, or if someone else had. The world was tilting, spinning, and she could only focus on one thing: the fragile rise and fall of the baby's chest. Too slow, too weak. Every second felt like a countdown to something irreversible. She pulled him closer, pressing him against her chest, trying to shield him from the cold, from the wind, from the sheer emptiness of the cemetery that had nearly claimed him. Around her, people were murmuring, whispering in hushed, horrified tones. Some were crying. Others just stared in stunned silence. No one knew what to do. No one could understand why. Why had this baby been left here? Who had done this? How long had he been out in the open, alone, without food, without warmth, without anyone to hold him? She forced herself to block out the noise, to focus. The ambulance. They needed to get to the hospital. She had to keep him awake, had to keep him alive. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might break her ribs. "Stay with me," she whispered, over and over, rocking the baby gently, as if the motion alone could somehow keep his tiny heart beating. The sirens came faster than she expected, but even as the paramedics rushed toward her, even as they carefully pried the baby from her arms and placed him on a stretcher, A terrible, suffocating dread wrapped around her like a vice. What if it was too late? What if he had already been out there too long? She stood frozen, watching as the ambulance doors slammed shut, the siren wailing as it sped off toward the hospital. Everything felt like a blur. She barely registered the questions being thrown at her, by the police, by the onlookers, by the reporters who were already showing up, eager to turn tragedy into news. But she didn't care about any of them. The only thing that mattered was that baby. The only thing that mattered was whether he would survive. She had never felt so powerless in her life. The ride to the hospital was a blur, her thoughts tangled in a mess of fear, anger, and disbelief. Who could have done this? The question burned in her mind like fire, but no answer would come. All she could do was sit in the back of the police car, staring out the window as the ambulance disappeared down the road. The officer driving tried to ask her questions, basic ones like her relation to the child if she had any idea who might have left him there, but she could barely process them. It felt like every word had to force its way past a lump in her throat. "He's my nephew," she finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Just saying it out loud made it feel more real, more horrifying. Her sister had died 3 days ago, and now her son had nearly died too, left to fate on the very earth where she had been buried. The thought made her stomach turn. Had Maria even known? Had she known she was carrying him before she died? Was it possible she had given birth right before her death? The timeline didn't make sense. The doctors had told her Maria had died suddenly, but there had been no mention of a baby. And yet here he was, proof of something much darker lurking beneath the surface of what she had been told. Someone had known. Someone had made the decision to leave that child to die. Her hands clenched into fists as the hospital came into view, its bright, sterile lights flickering in the early morning haze. The second the car stopped, she bolted out, ignoring the officers still calling after her, running inside as fast as her legs would carry her. "The baby, where is he?" she demanded at the front desk, her voice cracking under the weight of panic. The nurse glanced up, her expression tight. "They're working on him now." Those words nearly sent her to her knees. "Please," she begged, barely aware of the tears stinging her eyes. "Please tell me he's going to be okay." The nurse hesitated. That hesitation was enough to make her stomach drop. They didn't know. They couldn't know. The baby had been so weak, his heartbeat barely there. The next moments passed in a fog of pacing, waiting. Desperate prayers whispered under her breath to a God she wasn't even sure was listening. She couldn't sit down. She couldn't stop moving. If she stopped, the fear would eat her alive. And then finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor stepped out, his face unreadable. She rushed to him before he could even say a word, her entire body trembling. "Is he?" She couldn't even finish the sentence. The doctor exhaled heavily, then nodded. "He's alive, but it was close." The relief hit her so hard that her legs nearly gave out. She gripped the edge of the counter beside her, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she tried to process the words. "He's alive." She had been preparing for the worst, for the kind of grief that would hollow her out from the inside. But now, standing in the hospital corridor with her pulse roaring in her ears, she realized that this was only the beginning. "Can I see him?" she asked, her voice still trembling. The doctor hesitated for a moment before nodding. "He's in the neonatal intensive care unit. He's stable but weak. His body temperature was dangerously low when they brought him in. We had to work fast to prevent hypothermia from shutting down his organs." The words made her stomach twist. How long had he been out there? No one knew. No one could say for sure. But the fact that he had survived it all, that he had managed to cling to life despite the cold, despite the hunger, despite everything, it was a miracle. She followed the doctor down the hall, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. The hallways felt endless, stretching on forever, each step heavy with fear and anticipation. And then, finally, they stopped in front of a glass window. Her breath hitched at the sight before her. There he was, the tiny baby she had pulled from the grave, now lying in an incubator, wires and tubes attached to his frail little body. He looked even smaller now, dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding him. His skin was still pale, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. She pressed her palm against the glass, a lump forming in her throat. He shouldn't be here. He should have been safe, warm, in the arms of his mother, not in a hospital, not fighting for his life because someone had decided he didn't deserve to live. Anger burned through her veins, hot and sharp, mixing with the sorrow that had already settled deep inside her bones. She had spent the last 3 days grieving her sister, mourning the life that had been taken too soon. And now, standing there, staring at this helpless child, she realized that she didn't have the luxury of grief anymore. She had to fight. She didn't know how. She didn't know what it would take. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whoever had left him there wasn't going to get away with it. The relief hit her so hard that her legs nearly gave out. She gripped the edge of the counter beside her, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she tried to process the words. He's alive. She had been preparing for the worst, for the kind of grief that would hollow her out from the inside. But now, standing in the hospital corridor with her pulse roaring in her ears, she realized that this was only the beginning. "Can I see him?" she asked, her voice still trembling. The doctor hesitated for a moment before nodding. "He's in the neonatal intensive care unit. He's stable but weak. His body temperature was dangerously low when they brought him in. We had to work fast to prevent hypothermia from shutting down his organs." The words made her stomach twist. How long had he been out there? No one knew. No one could say for sure. But the fact that he had survived at all, that he had managed to cling to life despite the cold, despite the hunger, despite everything, it was a miracle. She followed the doctor down the hall, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. The hallways felt endless, stretching on forever, each step heavy with fear and anticipation. And then finally, they stopped in front of a glass window. Her breath hitched at the sight before her. There he was, the tiny baby she had pulled from the grave, now lying in an incubator, wires and tubes attached to his frail little body. He looked even smaller now, dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding him. His skin was still pale, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. She pressed her palm against the glass, a lump forming in her throat. He shouldn't be here. He should have been safe, warm, in the arms of his mother, not in a hospital, not fighting for his life because someone had decided he didn't deserve to live. Anger burned through her veins, hot and sharp, mixing with the sorrow that had already settled deep inside her bones. She had spent the last 3 days grieving her sister, mourning the life that had been taken too soon. And now, standing there, staring at this helpless child, she realized that she didn't have the luxury of grief anymore. She had to fight. She didn't know how. She didn't know what it would take. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whoever had left him there wasn't going to get away with it. The weight of it all pressed down on her, heavier than anything she had ever felt before. Grief, rage, exhaustion. It all mixed together into something sharp, something unbearable. But she didn't have time to break down. Not now. She turned to the doctor, forcing herself to push past the knot in her throat. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The doctor studied her for a moment before speaking. "We need to monitor him closely for the next 48 hours. His body is still weak, and we're concerned about possible complications from prolonged exposure. We've stabilized his temperature, but he's severely dehydrated and malnourished. If he had been out there much longer..." He trailed off, but she understood what he wasn't saying. If no one had found him, he would have died. That realization struck her like a physical blow. She clenched her fists, swallowing the bitter taste in her mouth. Someone had done this. Someone had made the choice to leave that baby alone in the cold, to let him suffer. And that someone had to pay. She wasn't naive. She knew how these things worked. If she didn't push, if she didn't demand answers, The world would keep moving forward as if nothing had happened. And she couldn't let that happen. "What about the police?" and she asked, turning to the officer who had followed them into the hallway. "Are they investigating?" The officer, a man in his early 40s with tired eyes and a stiff posture, nodded. "We're looking into it. But we need more information. Do you have any idea who could have done this?" She scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Yeah, I have an idea." The moment she said it, she felt her pulse spike. James. Of course it was him. Who else would be so cruel? Who else would have the motive, the means, the sheer heartlessness to do something like this? But knowing and proving were two different things. And she knew that as long as he had money, as long as he had influence, he would try to walk away from this. Her stomach twisted at the thought. She couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't. The baby was still fighting, still alive, and that meant she had a chance to make sure justice was served. She just had to figure out how. The next few hours passed in a haze of waiting, of pacing back and forth in that hospital hallway, of running the same thoughts over and over in her mind until they felt like knives against her skull. The police were doing their job, or at least that's what they said. But she knew better than to just sit back and trust that justice would happen on its own. People like James Morgan didn't face consequences unless someone forced them to. And she was ready to be that person. She stayed near the NICU, watching through the glass as the baby, her nephew, fought for every breath. There was something unbearably cruel about seeing someone so small, so helpless, surrounded by wires and machines, his tiny fingers twitching in his sleep. Every time his breathing hitched, her heart stopped. Every time a monitor beeped, she felt her body tense, waiting for the worst. She couldn't leave. She wouldn't. If something happened, if he took a turn for the worse, she had to be there. He had already been left alone once. She wasn't going to let it happen again. The officer came back a little after noon, carrying a notepad and looking more exhausted than before. "We've reviewed the security footage from the cemetery," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "There's something there." Her heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" He hesitated. "The footage is grainy. It's not great, but we can see someone approaching the grave around 3 a.m. Tall, broad-shouldered, could be a man, could be someone wearing heavy clothes. Hard to tell." She clenched her jaw. "James, it had to be him, or at the very least, someone working for him." The officer sighed. "It's not enough to make an arrest, not yet, but we're following leads." That wasn't good enough, not for her. "And in the meantime," she snapped, crossing her arms, "he just gets to walk around like nothing happened? Like he didn't try to kill his own son?" The officer exhaled, slow and heavy. "I understand you're upset." "Upset?" She almost laughed. "That's a nice way to put it." She shook her head, turning back to the window, staring at the baby who had already been through more in his few days of life than most people went through in years. "Tell me something," she said, her voice quieter now. "If that were your child in there, would you be satisfied with just following leads?" The silence that followed was answer enough. She didn't wait for the officer to answer. She already knew he wouldn't say what she wanted to hear. Justice moves slow when the guilty have money. That was a fact she had learned the hard way. But this time, she wasn't going to let the system drag its feet until the whole thing faded away. This time, she was going to make them act. She turned away from the NICU window, her mind already racing ahead, calculating her next steps. If the police weren't going to push harder, then she would. She pulled out her phone and started making calls. First, to a lawyer. Because if this was going to turn into a fight, she needed someone who knew the battlefield. Then, to a journalist. Because the one thing James Morgan feared more than the law was bad press. It didn't take long for the story to spread. By the time the sun had started setting outside the hospital, local news stations were already picking up the headline, "Newborn found abandoned on mother's grave. Father under suspicion." She watched from the waiting room as the report started circulating, her pulse pounding. She could already picture James watching the same broadcast, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching into fists. Good. Let him feel what it's like to be exposed. Let him know that he wasn't just going to walk away from this. A part of her knew this was dangerous. Men like him didn't like being backed into a corner, but she didn't care. He deserved it. And if this was the only way to make sure that baby got justice, then she was willing to burn every bridge she had to do it. When she finally returned to the NICU, her body felt drained, her mind exhausted, but she couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until she knew he was safe. She pressed her hand against the glass, watching the baby's tiny chest rise and fall. He had no idea what was happening. No idea that the world outside this hospital was already fighting over his life. But she would protect him, no matter what. The backlash came faster than she expected. Within hours of the news breaking, she started receiving messages, some from people in town, horrified by what had happened, offering support or asking if the baby was okay. Others, less kind, warning her to stop, to be careful, to think about what she was doing. She knew exactly where those messages were coming from. James had connections, people who would rather see this whole thing buried than let it turn into a public scandal. But she didn't care. Let them threaten her. Let them try to intimidate her. She wasn't going to stop, not when the truth was finally coming to light. The police had been slow before, hesitant, but now with the public watching, with reporters demanding answers, they had no choice but to move. That night, while she sat in the hospital waiting room, scrolling through article after article about the case, she got the call she had been waiting for. "We have something," the officer told her. His voice was different this time, no longer tired, no longer hesitant. One of the hospital staff came forward, said James was seen here the night before the baby was found. She sat up so fast that her vision swam. There it was. Proof that he had been there, that he had known, that this wasn't just some tragic accident or misunderstanding. He had been near the NICU, watching, waiting. And then hours later, the baby had been left to die. Her hands clenched into fists. How could someone be so cruel? How could he have looked at his own son, so small, so helpless, and still made the choice to walk away? "We're bringing him in for questioning," the officer said. And for the first time since this nightmare had started, she felt something close to relief. They were running out of ways to protect him, running out of places for him to hide. Justice was coming. She barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind dragged her back to the cemetery, to the image of that tiny, freezing body lying on her sister's grave. The rage, the helplessness, it all churned inside her, making it impossible to rest. But she didn't need rest. Not yet. Not when there was still so much left to do. By morning, the story had exploded. National outlets had picked it up, and now it wasn't just a local tragedy. It was everywhere. People were talking, demanding answers. James Morgan's name was being plastered across headlines, and the pressure was building, exactly as she had planned. She was still at the hospital, pacing the hall outside the NICU, when the news broke that James had been taken in for questioning. It wasn't an arrest, not yet, but it was something. Enough to send a message. You are not untouchable, not this time. She stepped outside for the first time in hours, inhaling deeply as the cool air hit her face. She should have felt better, should have felt like she was winning, but all she could think about was how none of this should have happened in the first place. That baby should have been home, safe, with his mother. Not here, not alone, not fighting for his life because someone decided he didn't deserve to exist. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and when she pulled it out, she saw an unfamiliar number. Blocked. She hesitated, then answered. Silence, and then a voice. Low. Calm. Too calm. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Her blood ran cold. She didn't respond. The voice continued. Walk away from this, now, before you regret it. The call ended. She stared at her phone, gripping it so hard her knuckles turned white. So this was how they wanted to play it. Threats. Warnings. Cowardice. She took a deep breath, shoving her phone back into her pocket. Let them try. Let them send their messages, make their calls. She wasn't afraid. She had already lost her sister. She wasn't going to lose this fight too. The hospital felt like both a sanctuary and a battlefield. Inside, the baby was slowly stabilizing, his tiny body fighting against the odds, the machines around him beeping in steady reassurance. He was holding on. But outside those walls, the war was still raging. The threats had started small, anonymous messages, hushed warnings, but they were escalating. That morning, when she stepped outside to get some air, she noticed a black SUV parked across the street. It had been there for over an hour. Too long to be a coincidence. She didn't panic. She refused to. Instead, she pulled out her phone and snapped a photo, making sure whoever was inside knew that she wasn't afraid to document everything. The SUV pulled away a few minutes later, but the unease settled deep in her bones. They were watching. James Morgan wasn't just going to roll over and accept what was coming. He was going to fight, to intimidate, to manipulate the system in his favor. But she had expected that. She was ready. Later that afternoon, an officer approached her at the hospital. "We have something else," he said, his expression unreadable. Security footage from the parking lot of James Morgan's estate. It shows one of his men leaving the property at 2:45 a.m., the same night the baby was found. Her breath hitched. "Who?" The officer hesitated, then sighed. "Eric Wallace." The name sent a shiver down her spine. Wallace was James's right-hand man. If he was involved, that meant James had been directly pulling the strings. This wasn't just a theory anymore. This was evidence. "We need him to talk," the officer continued. "If we can get him to flip on James, we can push for an arrest." She nodded, her pulse racing. They were getting closer. The walls were closing in. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt it. The shift. The moment where justice wasn't just a distant hope, but something real. Something within reach. She didn't have to wait long to see the fallout. By the next morning, Eric Wallace was in police custody. He had been picked up on a separate charge, something minor, just enough to hold him, to make him sweat. And it worked. By the time the afternoon rolled around, she got the call. He was talking. The moment she heard those words, something inside her shifted. She had spent the last few days feeling like she was drowning, like she was screaming into a void, fighting against an enemy too powerful to touch. But now she had proof. Now the police had something solid, not just speculation, not just suspicion, a direct link. Wallace had admitted that James had ordered the baby to be taken care of. He hadn't said the words outright, hadn't needed to. The meaning had been clear. Get rid of him. Make sure he doesn't come back. Wallace had followed orders, had driven in the dead of night carrying that tiny, fragile life in his arms, and had left him there, alone. She couldn't breathe for a second, couldn't think, the cruelty of it, the sheer, unbearable evil of what had been done. She had always known James was heartless, had always known he only cared about himself. But hearing the details, hearing how methodical, how deliberate it had been, it made her sick. But she pushed past it. There was no time to fall apart, not when they were this close. "What happens now?" she asked, gripping her phone so tightly it might have cracked. The officer on the other end didn't hesitate. "We're getting a warrant for James Morgan's arrest." She let out a shaky breath, letting it sink in. This was it. This was the moment. James had spent his life untouchable, skating past consequences, buying his way out of every mistake. But not this time. Not now. She turned to look through the NICU window, watching as the baby, her nephew, slept peacefully, unaware of the battle that had been waged for him. For the first time, she let herself believe that he was going to be okay. The arrest happened that evening. She wasn't there to see it. She was still at the hospital, still sitting in the same chair she had barely left since the day this nightmare began. But she didn't need to be there. The news spread fast. James Morgan, taken into custody. The words felt surreal, like something out of a dream she hadn't let herself believe in until now. But it was real. He was finally going to face the consequences. For once, money hadn't saved him. Influence hadn't erased what he had done. He had tried to kill his own child, and now the world knew it. There was no escaping this. She let out a long breath, feeling something she hadn't felt in days, something like relief. But it wasn't over yet. The fight for custody was still ahead. The legal battles, the hearings, the endless paperwork. But she didn't care. She would go through all of it if it meant keeping that baby safe. And that night, for the first time in what felt like forever, she let herself relax. The hospital was quieter now. The machines beeped steadily, the dim lights casting a soft glow over the NICU. She stood by the incubator, pressing her hand gently against the glass. He was still so small, still so fragile. But he had survived. He had fought, just like she had. She whispered more to herself than to him. "We made it." The words felt heavy, filled with everything they had been through, everything they had lost, but also everything they still had. He wasn't alone anymore, and neither was she.